Well, welcome everybody to episode 3 of the Community CloudCast. I'm Eric Shups, joined by my fellow co-host Paul McCollum, and our special guests this week, Moyez and Gaurav. Welcome everybody to this third installment. A few things before we get into our discussion here. First off, folks, if you would like to ask any questions of our panel, and we hope you do, you can drop those comments directly into Facebook or YouTube, whichever way you are consuming this stream, and we will pass those comments along to our panelists so they can respond. Any links that we have to share external information after the show is done, we'll put them in the show notes, and you can pick those up on our YouTube channel, which we have a link to here momentarily on another slide. And you can go check those out. In fact, here they are. There is the links to the YouTube channel and to Facebook as well. You can consume either way that works for you. Of course, we normally do these on the third Thursday of every month, but we moved it up a day this month to facilitate our other host, who unfortunately had some conflicts with the upcoming Yom Kippur holiday. So unfortunately, Jason couldn't make it today, but he will be back with us next month and his regular SharePoint Longhorn segment. Our guests today are Moyez, and I hope not to get these names too wrong, Thanawala and Gaurav Karki. Did I get close, guys?
Yep.
Very good.
Pretty good. All right.
Little misspelling on Gaurav. I had to.
Did I miss it up?
I tried to do the A and the U and the U and the A wrong about. I swear I found 3 different ways to do two things, but
I got it wrong. Okay, I will fix it. So Gaurav. Sorry about that. You probably get that misspelled as often as I get my last name misspelled.
No, I think I need to change my spelling because like I a lot of people get this spelling the first time. So,
well, I feel your pain. Everyone's always putting a C in my last name where it doesn't belong. So, so today, let me just back up a second. Today, we're going to do a panel discussion with our guests, and we're going to veer off in a little bit different direction as we set up when we started this. This is a pure cloud webcast, and so we're going to touch on topics outside of the Microsoft world. Today, we're going to concentrate heavily on the Salesforce space, but we're also happy to talk about Amazon Web Services, IBM, anything that's cloud focused. Will be part of our discussion. So we wanted to bring you something mostly Salesforce-y this time around. There's some big things coming up. I want to make sure that those get covered. So we'll be diving deep into that this month. Want to thank our sponsors, of course, Aptigent and their Power Tools product for Power Platform, Nintex, IBM, and Salesforce, which you can find in the Salesforce App Exchange. Just search for Power Tools to add over 90 utility actions to your visual flows and process builder. Events coming up here in Dallas. ShareCloud Summit is still on for September 28th. You can register at sharecloudsummit.com. Take note that the other event we discussed last month was the conference a few weeks later in October. That has since been rescheduled for, I believe, February. Even though it was going to happen in the same venue. So that has been changed. The one remaining event here in Dallas will be the ShareCloud Summit. Coming up on September 28th. I will be there, so I hope to see all of you there as well. And then there's a biggie coming up for Salesforce, and that is the annual Dreamforce conference, which once again this year will be mostly a digital event. You can get more information and register at salesforce.com/Dreamforce. Paul, I understand there is a bit of a story. You might have something to share about the upcoming Dreamforce?
Yeah, so by invite only, there are 6,000 people that are attending it in person, as opposed to the 175,000 and up from years past. And I think 1/3,000th of the invitees are on this call currently. So yeah, Moyez and I, they reached out to user group leaders, and Moyez and I are both active members of the community. And we're invited. I am still a little up in the air on whether or how much I'll be participating. I think Moyez, I think you declined, even though
I got my invitation to attend one day after I canceled my hotel. So I won't be attending this year, which is a shame. I think it's going to be fun after after COVID and the cancellation last year. So I was looking forward to it, but we'll do it again next year.
I'm excited. As my degree is actually in microbiology, and I'm actually intrigued by all of the heavy duty antivirus and things that they're doing. So I've got a bag full of tests to take. They're being very aggressive with their wanting to make sure that it's safe to attend. So it's a neat study from both a CDC enthusiast and a and a Dreamforce enthusiast. I think this will be my 5th year going, but yeah, pretty excited.
Gaurav, will you be attending?
No, unfortunately.
Yeah, Gaurav is a connection from the cloud and enterprise architecture space. Gaurav is versed in all of the clouds. He's not necessarily a Salesforce. That may be the one place you don't. I haven't seen you have certifications from Gaurav.
That's the only one.
All the other certifications, and that's the introduction I can give Gaurav. Is he knows everything except he's certified at every cloud except maybe Salesforce.
All right.
Yeah, I have not got chance to work on Salesforce yet.
Well, we can fix that.
Well, good.
Yeah,
we can expand our conversation today. That's awesome.
And a couple of AWS and the Azures. What else am I missing? Did you get the IBM or Oracle clouds?
No, not on IBM and Oracle. I briefly attended a training session on Oracle, but I think they are going onto a new platform. So whatever I learned on that training, I think it's already obsolete.
Yeah, I think Oracle's up to their 3.0 cloud version, and Moyez runs a distinguished consultancy service in Dallas, and so he's heavily versed in multiple clouds and integrations, and then has been a Salesforce community leader and mentor for quite some time as well. So I'll give that as introductions to our cast here.
Well, this is good. Gaurav, are you well versed in the Google Cloud?
Yes, I actually, before joining this company, I actually worked on 2 projects on Google Cloud. But for last a year or so, I am working mainly on AWS. Last month, I picked up Azure. So right now, Azure is kind of fresh to me. I have not worked Azure in maybe 3-4 years.
Okay. That's good. I'm going to have lots of questions.
I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. All right. So, just rounding it out on Dreamforce, you can register for that. It's a digital event. In fact, I just got done with the IBM version at their TechCon event just a couple weeks ago that was also digital only, which I think we're all becoming used to these days with these conferences going digital. So it'll be a good event. There's a few things in there that I'll be paying attention to. Right. So normally this is Paul's segment talking about his updates. Do you have any news that you wanted to share, Paul, or shall we move on? No news. Now you're muted.
See, this technology stuff is hard.
Very hard.
We have a CloudCast, but yeah, no, I'm sorry. I've been a bit occupied with a job change. I've moved back to Accenture Consulting full time. I do not know why my microphone or my camera keeps focusing in and out. I keep meaning to.
Maybe it's the cat in the background.
I think the cat is moving. Yeah. So your camera is going to autofocus, I believe.
Now she wants to contribute. All right. So we'll move on from there. As we mentioned, Jason would normally be doing his segment. He couldn't join us this month, so I hope he has a great holiday. And I actually do have a few things that I want to share before we jump into our wide-ranging discussion this month. So some Azure news that caught my eye, specifically the first topic around on-demand capacity reservations in Azure. So I'm working on a project now that will have all SharePoint DR in Azure. And so there's a lot of considerations with that, but it's not just SharePoint. It's Azure will become the DR environment for the entire enterprise. So there's a lot of moving parts there. And one of the big concerns around that, especially at an enterprise level, is the cost. In the past, in order to really do DR in Azure, you had to spin up and reserve instances for all of the VMs that you would need, and have them all there and in place and paying for them, and have a committed contract for all of those resources. So DR was exceptionally expensive to do in Azure. With the new on-demand capacity reservations, it means that you can pre-allocate your compute capacity on a pay-as-you-go basis. So you've pre-allocated it all, you're paying a base level for it, but then when you actually go to spin everything up and bring those VM instances online is when your costs really start to incur, which is exactly how you want it to be for DR environment. You don't want to pay for DR as if it is live and the same costs as live when you don't need it most of the time, and only spin it up when you do. So there's a link, I'll put that into the show notes where you can get some more information on the on-demand capacity reservations, which I think is a great new offering from a DR perspective. Also, from a DR-ish perspective, is the zone redundant storage for Azure disks. So this allows sync replication across multiple zones and shared disks in a particular region. So for example, if you have a SQL always on cluster with Windows failover clustering and you want it to span multiple zones, you now can. You can have one of your VMs in, or one of your instances, which is a VM, in one region, another one, or in one zone, another one, another zone, and then your shared disks in a completely different zone altogether. This is really common, especially here in Texas and in the South, but it happens a lot in Texas where you have folks in Houston that want to have DR capability in Dallas because we're inland, they're on the coast. And whenever there's a hurricane event, it's the Houston folks coming inward. San Antonio is a little bit too close. So it would typically be Austin or Dallas as your next zone. So this gives you some capability to stretch, for example, if you had a SQL failover cluster across those zones, you could have one node in each place, and then your failover is very simple. And you would just go in and, as you typically would in SSMS, and fail those over, and you don't have to worry about a big DR scenario flipping entire clusters over. This is a really neat capability, and now in preview, you can go and grab that and set it up in your environment. There's each one of these leads to a blog post page talking out more in depth about that particular piece of technology. Obviously, there's lots of more detail there about instances and how to add your subscriptions and set those up. So go check the links for those. Another one that I've been following for a while is the whole app containerization of existing apps concept. So one of the things that is a big challenge in the enterprise, or one of the big blockers for the enterprise, is they've got all this legacy applications running on, in this particular scenario from a Microsoft perspective, ASP.NET. Could be ASP.NET MVC running on Windows machines, usually in a VMware or other type of virtualization environment. And those have a lot of interdependencies on other pieces of the stack, especially SQL and other backend components. So Microsoft introduced this idea of doing containerization for your apps, where you can install an agent and analyze those dependencies and look at your stack, and it will produce from that a Docker or Kubernetes configuration that you can then go set up in Azure. And there's even a little wizard to make that happen. So you point it at your existing applications, does an inventory, and you can move those up, which is great. If your apps are mostly self-contained, this works exceptionally well. They're running just on a single IaaS instance, or a small number of IaaS instances, and they don't have a lot of external dependencies. The containerization stuff is pretty straightforward, and it's actually relatively inexpensive to implement. However, those of us who've built a ton of ASP.NET web applications over time know that it's never quite that simple. You've got your middle tier layer, you've got SQL, you may have other internal LOB systems. So they've released this new Azure Migrate for ASP.NET web apps, which you have an appliance that you install in a VMware. environment, and it goes out and inventories up to, I think it's 20,000 applications that you can inventory, and it actually looks into the web config files and looks at your dependencies, finds your SQL connection strings, and it builds you a map of dependencies for each one of these applications that you're running, that you can then translate into Azure resources. And it even has a costing calculator built into it to help you minimize the amount of cost for those container, or for those objects as you move them into Azure. And obviously moving towards a containerization concept, that's part and parcel of this, but it really gives enterprise customers the capability now to analyze their existing environment and create a path of moving that directly to Azure, whether that's in straight up VMs, whether it's containerized, whether it's going to app services or Kubernetes service. So we now have a great way to go from legacy on-prem web apps all the way into cloud enabled applications in a wizard type of environment. So I think this is a great tool. I think it should have a lot of traction within the enterprise. You can learn more about it with the links that we have there. And if you want to refresh yourself on the containerization pieces, I put a link up to that as well. So those are a few tidbits I wanted to share from the Azure side. So now what I'd like to do, if everybody's amenable to it, is just open this up for some general discussion. We have Moyez here to give us our Salesforce input, and Gaurav to talk about everything else, apparently, with the exception of Salesforce. So Paul, why don't you lead this off with a bit of Salesforce conversation here, and then we'll take it from there.
Yeah, so containerization is actually an interesting piece of kit that is getting picked up more and more. Salesforce, I think it was a year ago, announced Hyperforce, and I just posted a link for that. That, if I'm reading in between the lines, and some of the information on it is not super detailed yet, is an elastic enablement for Salesforce to run storage, compute, workloads inside of all of the public clouds. So Google, Amazon, and Azure are supposed to be included in that. You're supposed to be able to, and I'm not sure. Some of my initial thought was that Hyperforce was going to be a containerized version of Salesforce, where you could actually host your Salesforce instance inside of Azure and run it inside of a managed container on Azure, a managed container on AWS. I am not sure if that has changed to more of a linking. Moyez, have you seen any more detail on Hyperforce?
I have not to that level. My thinking from everything that I've seen about the product, and really the strategy that they're using overall, is more a connectivity type enablement, as opposed to letting Salesforce run on external clouds. Now, I have, at the enterprise level, heard these discussions carried out, and in fact, they allow a little bit of that on debugging, right? You can do local computer debugging. So they bring some of the metadata in and let you run it on your PC. But as a full-blown platform, I haven't seen much in the way of saying, here's a piece of code, you can containerize it and run it elsewhere. Now, I tell you what they have done is the announcements that I've seen have alluded to Salesforce running its own platform and allowing you to select the type of platform that they run on your behalf, on the various different clouds. I think that discussion is in its infancy right now. The majority of what I'm seeing is this enablement, where you can treat external data as if it lives directly inside of Salesforce, and then expose Salesforce data to things like Lambda functions and others in a more elegant way than exporting it to AWS. So I've seen that. but actually giving you a piece of code that you can containerize and then place on a platform of your choice. I haven't really heard much in the way of kind of that capability.
Yeah, the feeling that I got from the way it was worded was that you wouldn't be given, they would, and I think that's primarily probably what's slowing it down, is I don't think they intend to hand over container code. They will probably manage it, put it in, load it, configure it, get it running, and then it sits on your compute. But I think it's going to be a little bit more hands off than the current way that people work with containers, where you're actually getting to, fully configure and move stuff around. I think they're still going to want to have some more control over that.
I think it's one we'll be watching closely, because there is definitely a strategy in place to move beyond the silo that is Salesforce, right? Not everything that's inside of Salesforce ought to remain in Salesforce, breaking down the barriers. So I am seeing a lot about that. And Paul, and I think Eric and Gaurav, you may not know this. One of the ways in which I get a lot of my technology news is by reading the company's 10K and 10Qs. It really does point to where their head is. I'm a great fan of kind of peeking at what management thinks we ought to be doing next. And really, I do believe they're in this position where they want to allow the data to remain inside Salesforce, or to remain inside AWS if it's an AWS or Azure native data stack, and make the data more transparently available in real time, on demand, or in a dynamic way. So you can run SQL queries against your Salesforce database, and SQL queries against your Azure databases, etc. One of the things that I think is kind of interesting, which I don't know if we'll see a fusion of the Salesforce approach with kind of industry open standards, but the DBT technology is one that I think Salesforce may start leaning into. Speculation on my part, but the idea that you can run standard SQL type queries across not just Azure and potentially AWS and other clouds, but against the Salesforce stack as well. It's an intriguing technology. Let me see if I can post a link here to that. It's at Get DBT, open source kind of uh, an approach. But I think that this might be something that Salesforce embraces next. I just see kind of the direction in which they're headed on their multi-cloud strategy. I think this is where we might see them go next. Again, speculation on my part, but certainly, in my opinion, what's happening inside of Salesforce is this desire to completely break down the silo walls. Um, it's not new for them. They introduced this concept of external objects, I think maybe 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago. Paul, am I getting that time frame correct? And this is just an extension or an expansion of that strategy. So yeah, I think exciting and interesting things happening. For the longest time, those of us who've been developing solutions in Salesforce have always understood that Salesforce storage is very expensive, and anytime we can throw Salesforce storage off onto another platform, we've been doing that. But then there's all that overhead of bringing it back dynamically as it's needed. Now, going forward, I think we are in this next generation of Salesforce itself is going to build that enablement for us. And we're seeing that. We've worked with external objects, and I tell you, it's very elegant. I love it.
So you mentioned several times the whole multi-cloud approach. I wanted to get Gaurav's input on this because you've worked with multiple cloud providers. We have a multi-cloud solution. We use Azure. We use IBM as our cloud provider. But before we started doing that, coming from an Azure Microsoft mindset, I worked with customers that were just sort of one cloud. You were either Azure or you were Google or you were AWS. Gaurav, are you seeing now that there's a lot more customers taking bits and pieces from multiple clouds and bringing those together rather than just being siloed onto one platform?
Yes, I have seen a lot of customer interested in using multi-cloud platform. Actually, before joining Raytheon, I was actually designing a solution for one of the companies that were using not only a multi-cloud platform there, but actually using multiple regions on each of these multiple clouds. The biggest challenges companies are facing with multi-cloud approach are two things. One thing is they do not want to use cloud-specific services. For example, if they are trying to use containerization, they don't want to use the cloud specific container implementation like EKS or AKS or Google Container Services. So they want to come up with their own, like generic Kubernetes implementation or whatever that may be. The other biggest challenges they were having is with the network connectivities between these multiple clouds. So since my previous company was kind of a network service provider, they were working with them to provide the backend network connectivity to connect all these cloud and multiple with their endpoints. The biggest challenge with that would to be how they're going to reroute their traffic to multiple clouds. Because if one region on one continent goes down, it's not up to the cloud services, the public cloud, to provide the backend network connectivities or the rerouting. It's up to the company itself on how they handle the connectivities. Having said that, people are looking into it and they are really interested into multi-cloud platform. A lot of companies that I have seen is at least they wanted to have their workload deployed into one public cloud, but they want to have their DR onto a different public cloud. At least that's where they were trying to at least get their footwords into multiple cloud.
So on that, just to expand, and one of the big challenges that I've seen a couple of different times is there's not really the granularity, or what I'm seeing is the development of granularity in cloud to cloud resource consumption. I had a disaster project fairly recently, not just disaster, but it took a wide leap towards towards a mountain as they were configuring cloud resources, and the scale of connections between the two clouds was underestimated by a factor of 10 or 20, which more than quadrupled the cost of the project. So a small project turned into a sub 200,000 turned into nearly $1 million project because of the inability to consume resources at a granular level. There were only two big buckets you could buy. Once you passed a certain threshold, you were at an enterprise account, and that this many connections meant you had to move from this bite-sized license slice to that really tore apart the project cost structure. And now I'm seeing that you can, what we're seeing with AWS is, being able to connect at the Lambda level. Hey, I want to process this. I want to just get charged for this node. I want to have a per connect charge. I don't want to cross a major threshold and wish I'd done some completely different engineering. We're seeing a lot more scalable, biteable licensing models come out, so that each cloud provider can take advantage of the other's strengths or weakness or offerings.
Yeah, there's some good points there. I recently had somewhat of a similar situation with a costing issues around, trying to get granular resources identified and moved, and that was even in a single cloud. But I'm wondering how. So, Moya, as you were talking about Salesforce sort of opening up to these multi-cloud environments and enabling those connections from those resources, and Gaurav, some of the challenges around customers trying to manage these multiple cloud things. From our perspective, we're seeing customers that are consumers of large cloud-based services. For example, they have Office 365 and they have Salesforce. Right? It's not necessarily they're all in on Office 365, so they have to have Dynamics. It's the opposite, actually. We're seeing a lot of people who have both. So now you have two cloud platforms. You may have some AWS. You're probably going to have some Azure. How are customer? That's a difficult map to put together, right? For customers to manage that implementation, there's crossover skills there. How do you, Gaurav, let me start with you there. How do you see customers managing that challenge and navigating a path through that?
I think it all boils down to the how you're gonna handle the integration and the back end, the traffic that goes from one cloud to another. So I have not worked with these big challenges, but I have somehow involved into designing like working with network engineers on designing the connectivities between how, like at least you have certain implementation in your corporate data center, which might be sitting in one places. In order for you to connect to the cloud, at least in an enterprise level, you need to have a dedicated connection to this cloud. And so you have to have either in your data center presence to the point of presence for the cloud that you're connecting to, or you're going to may have to like have to have another data center which can provide you the direct connectivity to other cloud. Now, all your traffic is now flowing between that point of presence to your cloud. So now if you have two clouds, you need to find either your data center need to be in a location where both of your cloud provide that point of presence that goes through your like data center or your other network provider. And that's how actually you're like managing the connectivity between those two clouds. That's the backbone on like at the end of the day, like all your traffic has to flow somewhere. So I think at least I know of that label that companies were having designing their network so that at least they have the backend connectivities. And now that's after that it goes on to like how your applications is configured between like all this multi-cloud. One of the things that I recently encountered was that it is not as like a like they're using a SaaS or other application, but people like they were using multi-cloud, and they were since they said like the cloud is cheap, so I'm going to push all my backup to the cloud. They didn't realize that okay, like the storage is cheap, but how about the network transfer cost that goes through that? Is the little bandwidth is sufficient enough to push all those backups? Initially, the design was like we calculated that like all these Office 365 or the like other application that goes through this, it may like handle this one. So they like they subscribed for I don't know 1 gig or some subpar gig, but the backup was like at a certain point of time in the day, the backup was using all of the connection. And at the end of the day, when they get the bill, they say like okay, the network charge is up high. So that's one of the things that, like, people easily try to forget about when they're, like, connecting all those things. So yeah, all good, but how about all this cost that you are not seeing it in, like in front end?
Yeah, that's a good point. All the plumbing has to be there in place. Moyes, you have got to have these challenges working with customers, right? Especially at the application level of how to bring all this
Right.
stuff and get the plumbing going.
Right. So Gaurav is totally right. Let me expand upon kind of his thought there. Whenever we are working at the enterprise level, which is kind of where we make our home, you always come into an opinionated environment, right? So they already have legacy code that's sitting on legacy architecture. There's some component, usually a majority of the component of their architecture sits behind the firewall, on-prem, and they're now, in the last 5 years or so, they're beginning to push that out. So you're entering an opinionated environment, and thankfully, we're able to kind of identify wherever we've got an opinion that we want to be an Azure shop, or we want to be an AWS shop, or something along those lines. And we come in with a Salesforce instance, there is some difference in thinking. And let me point out kind of the two major ones that I encounter in terms of here's where we want to go. First of all, with Salesforce, unlike the other clouds, Salesforce obscures a lot of the management of the infrastructure away from you, right? So things like where is my org located, where's the instance located, how are we doing the backup? Salesforce kind of obfuscates that and says that's part of what we take care of for you. So that's a little bit different than if we're working with, okay, well, what is AWS going to cost us, because transactions come into play and bandwidth comes into play. So that's item number one, right? You're dealing with two different ways of charging the client for your services. I tend to think that the Salesforce method is a little bit simpler to talk to corporate executives about, because we're able to point to an exact dollar amount and kind of tell them this is what it's going to cost you. In many cases, they have negotiated contracts that don't really rely on bandwidth. They do rely on data storage, but it's a little bit simpler. Now, the second thing that comes into play in kind of what we see is the opinion of where they're headed, right? And this is not always based upon on the best available technology today. It's based upon a couple of things. One is, what is their legacy architecture? Have they traditionally been a Microsoft shop, in which case they're leaning towards Azure? You might even have a strong opinion by the IT managers saying, we're going to use Azure only. So don't talk to me about any other clouds. So once you've got that opinion, it's hard to kind of mold other things around them. I'll give you I'll sanitize an example for you, and kind of protect the guilty here. But I do want to tell you this one quick story, and then I'll kind of turn it back over to you. We had an instance where we had a perfect App Exchange product, very inexpensive, that allowed this one client to move all their extraneous storage from Salesforce into AWS. The product itself that we were buying was well baked, and it was a perfect fit from every way you look at it. Moving this data storage from Salesforce to AWS was a perfect fit, except that the opinion that existed, that the prevailing opinion of the house, was that we're an Azure shop. You need to do the same connector, but to Azure, and that presented some problems because no such product existed. We'd have to undertake a development from the ground up, which we did. Cost a lot more. Wasn't really the most logical thing to do, But because of the idea that humans get involved and there's an opinionated approach to technology, this plays a major kind of role in where we end up. We'd like to think as technologists that the most logical decisions prevail, but in fact, I think we need to recognize going into at least the enterprise space that we have humans involved, they have opinions, and we need to work within those confines.
Yeah, and let me know when Elvis gets here.
That's exactly correct. But we're finding a lot of this, right? They have an opinion. This is what they want to do. And even when you make the argument that, look, the bandwidth costs are going to be high, the storage costs are going to be high, the the dev costs are going to be high. No, that's fine. We're an AWS shop, we're an Azure shop, whatever it is. This is our opinion, and that's where we want to go.
So
humans.
With that, Moyez, one of the big challenges that I keep seeing is and I posted my little meter there, that each of the clouds has a different metering for their licensing, and they're getting more complex. But if you were to say, 5 years ago, I could say there's a good chunk of Microsoft's licensing that you bought a server, you bought a virtual server, and you were charged for how many hours during the day it was online. You could use infinite CPU during that time, but it was on or off. And if I am working in Amazon, I get charged, per connection. And then trying to right size a solution and tell your developers, okay, build a solution that doesn't have a whole lot of connections and only operates at this amount of time in the day, but pre-compresses its data so it's not storing a whole lot, but it's storing over here on the cheaper storage, but doing the CPU compression over here and then managing the connectivity in this way. And you're doing a whole bunch of backflips based on licensing, trying to get your application to be built the most ideal way from a budget perspective. As we design these perfect solutions, our budgeting and finance people come in and say, make it cost half as much. And then you start going in and trying to get your application or your developers to reconfigure the solution. And when you're having to jump through multiple types of make it do this, but don't have it do this way. Or at least if you do it that way, make sure it does it over here in this other cloud before it sends it to this one. And that was that big snafu that I had. They got asked, hey, can we look at our surveys? We're building surveys. We've got 10,000 per period, but we actually want to do trending on question versus on total survey score. Oh, no problem. We'll just send over each of the individual question answers as opposed to each of the survey answers. Oh, okay. Well, that just multiplied all of our data connections by a factor of 30.
Right.
Well, now that's a problem because the connection service that we used is charging us 30 times as much. And okay, let's redo everything. Let's reconfigure. Let's package it. Let's write everything into an encapsulated JSON packet and send it through another channel, re-import it someplace else, all because we don't have a simple and granular way for the clouds to communicate with each other without crossing these boundaries of licenses.
No, I totally agree. I think this is a challenge that we as technologists now have to take on. The problem is, if you say make it cost less, well, what does that mean? Under what conditions? Because our conditions are dynamic, as you just pointed out. So you can make accounting happy today, but then if we have a spike in data transfer or data storage or any of those types of things, and it just blows up, they come back to look at the technologist and say, I told you to make it cost less. Why did I suddenly get a $30,000 bill from this service? It's a difficult place to be. It's not just a technology question. It's now about the different ways in which the different components get charged back to the company. So yeah, tricky time for us, isn't it?
Well,
Yeah.
it definitely is, and something Gaurav said earlier really resonated with me. I'm an old school router jockey by trade, so that's what my founding in technology is pushing iOS command line when iOS was a Cisco thing, not an Apple thing, right?
Yeah, yeah. I can still do
but
my execute rules.
but we're entering this arena where the WAN has become the LAN, and it, any of us who've pushed bits across the wire knows the WAN is ridiculously complex, and there's all these minefields and all this complexity around connections and endpoints and transfer points and all these things happening. And I don't know that there's a lot of attention being paid to that. To your costing point about what is it actually going to cost us to do this? Here's the application cost, which is hard enough to get a hold of, especially if you're doing something in Azure. Try and figure out what anything costs you in Azure, right? It's horrifically difficult. But you drop down a level, what's it going to cost us to actually push these bits across the wire? How many interconnects do we need, and how many different providers do we have to go to make this happen? Gaurav, do you see that people they either don't think about it or they just don't realize the complexity that they're getting themselves into?
I think there's two things. People, most of things, if it depends on what kind of organization that you are. If it's like a small organization, they probably don't tend to think this as a like at as granular level as you are. But if you are a company which you are truly trying to do a multi-cloud and designing it correctly the first time, yes, then they are actually like putting all this thing into their cost model. However, not all these companies are this big corporation which really wants to do a multi-cloud, and they want to design it, and they want to take time to design and get things right. However, like in these days and age, we are approaching a place where like, okay, like as Moez said earlier, rightly said, that like, hey, we only want to get into this cloud, we don't want to get any other cloud, we want to design everything into this cloud efficiently. However, down the road, what we are all seeing is companies merger happens a lot. And when the company's merger happens, now all of a sudden the other companies is using a totally different cloud platform that you are using. And now like all of a sudden you are in a position that like now you're not going from bottom up, now you're going from top down approach. Like, now how do we integrate these two things? How do we manage our plumbing? How do we make our like all the basic infrastructure work between these two companies and between those two clouds? I think that is now more of a challenge that more and more companies are facing, and more companies are looking for expertise in that areas, like where how do we integrate those two things.
Yeah, really good point.
I smell a new role of a license architect.
Yeah.
It is not about which pieces of technology and which functionality. It's how you multiply and control the combinatorics of each cloud's licensing models.
It's a good point. It's a good point. So let's shift gears a little here to round out the time that we have left. I want to go around the horn and ask Paul. I'll start with you. What are you excited about? What things coming on the horizon are you seeing that you really want? Ooh, I want to learn about that. That sounds really cool.
Well, the evolution of granularity to where you can consume kind of piecemeal components of a cloud offering is really kind of what this conversation was about, or what the idea of bringing this group of people together was. I can do everything in Azure, and I have one bill, and I know how to control it. But if I try and do something in another cloud, it's really complicated, and I have to basically move in to both clouds and then pay a large amount of connector licensing to handle the both of them, and I'm not sure how to do that, and that doesn't change because the clouds were kind of always playing an all or nothing. you're in us, you're completely in one cloud, and you can do everything here in our one licensing model, and it's cheap and easy to understand. If you try to go to another one, it's a completely you're an alien in a strange land, a stranger in a strange land. And the connectivity and the translation wasn't there. And I think we're starting to see the evolution of that API surface where you can just consume and expose bits and pieces of it and pay for it simply. So it's going to be, that's what I'm excited about. I'm excited to see each of the players now starting to offer a better harness the best of all the offerings.
Moyez?
I do agree. I think what I'm most excited about is something that I think is going to happen next, right? We've seen a number of announcements where each of the clouds says that we will be able to transparently connect between our cloud, Salesforce, for instance, and AWS. And they make it easy. You don't have to be an API jockey to do it, right? So we're seeing that today. What I am excited about, and I think we're going to hopefully see this next, is a standardization, an industry standardization that says, here's how all clouds are going to do this. An open standard that says, in order to make data transparency a thing, here's how we are all going to do it. Right now, we're still in that kind of early stage where each of the clouds is kind of hand weaving that connection and saying, see, look how easy it is to connect our cloud to the other guy. But I think we're going to see somebody's going to say, hey, we need to standardize how these clouds. That's the day of true data democracy, right? When we can move data easily, right? Today we can, if you're an API jockey, right, you can certainly do all these things, but the ease with which your data becomes transparent to the other cloud, not just persisting it in another cloud, but another cloud behaving in a way that it's it's virtualized, right? The apps that are running on that cloud treat your data with permissions and security and all these other things, but make it their own. I think we're in the infancy of that approach. Watch this space because I think we're going to get there, and we're going to get there relatively fast. I think.
That would be exciting. Gaurav?
Yes, I agree with both Paul and Moez. And one of the things that cloud provider have realized this as well, that customer base and enterprise customer have changed. They do not want to rely on only one cloud. This all these open source communities, like developing all those things, and cloud have realized that as well, the cloud provider. So I think Google Anthos and Azure Migrate and AWS Migrate, all those things, they are now touting that, hey, like you can run your code anywhere. We will provide you the tool that that can move your workload from anywhere, from your on-premise to this cloud to that cloud, versus that where we will provide you that platform. But however, they say, and they do the tool as well, but on the flip side to this is, like the companies, all these cloud provider companies are buying those companies who are building this tool, like Anthos and all those things, and they are integrating into their cloud. So I'm excited to see how this is gonna play out in the future. But as Moya said, that we need some kind of external kind of like standardization, which I have seen mostly, like the Cloud Native Foundation is taking that initiative. And since now I'm working on Kubernetes since last year, I have seen, like this Cloud Native Foundation coming up with their own standard set of interfaces for all of the storage networking. So it has become easier for, like, hey, no matter where you host your Kubernetes environment, if you use this, like interface at the back end, like it's the same thing. I will provide you the interface, you can work it anywhere. So I think, like if this goes one step ahead and then use that for all the cloud provider, that they would, like a kind of like an API, like you use wherever, however you want to implement But if this interface, wherever the cloud is used, it's easier for you to migrate anywhere with a push of a button, then I think that would really help all the enterprise who are trying to get the benefits of going multi-cloud.
Yeah, that would be great. As the designated API jockey in this group, what I'm excited is to see that these concepts are actually making it down to the customer, that they're starting to realize that they need to design for interoperability from the ground up in their applications. So it's not only that they're looking to their service and cloud providers, it's that they're starting to think of building from the API layer up into their applications. Like they're sitting down and they're designing greenfield projects to say, okay, let's make all of our backends an API endpoint, and let's make them portable and containerizable so that they can shift and move, because all of those things would be great, but if we're locked into a bunch of legacy enterprise applications that don't have portability, it's not going to do any good anyway, right? And I think customers are starting to get that, at least the conversations that I'm having, get these ideas that you guys are talking about here, filtering down to their customer and making that into their design decisions, and go forward. And I'm pretty excited to see that continue.
Yeah, and one of the things that we know, like we choose not to use, like cloud specific containers for the same thing, right? We want to host our workload no matter where we want. We started as a like enterprise in hosting our Kubernetes environment in our enterprise data center. We swiftly moved it to AWS. Now it's running on 3 different environments. One, it's running on AWS, it's running on Azure, and now it's running, it's also running on our enterprise data center as well. So if we had choose one cloud, it's become it's very hard to move us, although the code are the same thing, right? I mean, the Kubernetes deployment container is, it's the same, but now we don't have to, be dependent on EKS or AKS. We use our own Kubernetes, we use our DevOps pipeline, we can deploy that on any cloud. And just although it's much less, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that the cloud provider provides on the Kubernetes, but we are happy that we can move this to any cloud.
Yeah, that's great stuff. So that brings us to a wrap, believe it or not. Been an hour, so I want to especially thank our guests today for joining us and having this conversation. I think we could certainly talk probably for hours, a lot of us, about these particular topics. Thank our sponsors, of course, Aptigent at aptigent.com, ShareCloud Summit here in the DFW area coming up, sharecloudsummit.com. I left it off this slide, but Dreamforce coming up September 21st through 23rd. So be sure and go to salesforce.com/Dreamforce to learn more about that. And with that, we'll go ahead and put a wrap on it for this month. We will see you all next month on the 3rd Thursday of the month. Great conversation, guys. Thank you for joining us. I thought it was really good and hope to do this again in the future. See you all.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.